in 1962 for $399, or about $4,100 in 2024, you could have purchased this McIntosh MX110 FM tuner preamplifier. It was rated at 0.2% THD through the auxiliary input and had a frequency response of plus or minus a half a dB from 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz. This particular version was the first version of the MX110 in 1963. They changed this balance thumb wheel, I guess it's called, to a knob to match the others. And that went on until 1967 is when I think they stopped making these guys. So the 62 one was the only year, as far as I can tell, that had that thumb wheel for the balance. And there's a few other things that are different, but for the most part that was the biggie. So we'll do our standard tour of the front and the back. Now this particular one is a bit in rough shape, but not as rough as some of them that I have seen. And then I'll pop the unit out of the case and pop the bottom cover, and we'll kind of see what the technology is that they used, as well as if it is pretty original. And of course there will be data to show how it performs today, and I will tell you what it was like using it and how it sounded to me. Here's a close-up view of the MX110. Volume control is here, the tuning control is here, and it's just an FM tuner. We do have a stereo indicator lamp that will come on, and here is our neat little tuning eye. Input selector is here. It does have an input for an auxiliary tape and 2 phonos. We have our balance control here, as well as balance controls for each of the bass and treble tone controls. We have settings here for doing reverse stereo, mono, and that kind of stuff, as well as our power on-off switch. So that's all part of this guy. We have something a little bit unusual, which is a 0-180 degrees phase shifter. We have tape monitor switch here, a loudness switch, and then high filter, low filter, and FM muting. If you remove part of the trim, you can get to some gain adjustment controls for the 2 phono inputs and then the auxiliary input. This obviously is the rear of a well-aged MX110. Kind of just shows what's going on with it. It does have switched and unswitched AC outlets. It has a slow blow user replaceable fuse here. So this tuner preamp does have 2 line level outputs for it, which is kind of nice. This kind of just shows all your other inputs and outputs. This is a view looking from the top down of the MX110, kind of just seeing what's going on. It looks to me like these 2 capacitors for the filter caps have been replaced. This is a view looking from the bottom of the MX110, kind of just shows how everything was hand wired together and just what it looks like. And this is just another view from the bottom, kind of looking at what's going on with the MX110. Here we have our standard THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with a 0 dBV signal applied to the auxiliary input, and I've adjusted the balance control as well as the volume and sub-volume control, I'm calling it, to give me about 0 dB of gain. We're pretty close to that. You can see the SNR for the right channel looks better than that of the left channel by about 10 dB. The specification for THD was that the maximum output, which I'm not quite sure what that is less than 0.2%. So we're doing pretty good on the THD, and overall it doesn't look so bad. Now, in case you're wondering what the harmonics are looking like, under a 0 dB gain, 1 volt RMS signal being applied to the auxiliary input, well, here's your answer. It's mixed, and depending which channel you're looking at, if you take the right channel right here, it's an odd harmonic, and it is higher than the second or even harmonic, which is opposite what you normally would expect with tube gear. However, our left channel, the even harmonic, is higher than the odd harmonic. So it kind of just depends on what channel, and it kind of follows that down the line, just kind of depends. It looks like, you know, over here our fourth order harmonic. The even are still higher than the fifth or odd, but right here the second and third kind of are mixed depending on which channel you're looking at. Right now I've doubled the level of the input signal to 2 volts RMS, 6 dBV, and you can see that the right channel distortion has gone up a fair amount, 1.125%. The left channel is actually right at the spec limit, which is 0.3% THD. SNRs don't look too bad, 75 dB, 79 dB. However, the THD plus noise has certainly gone up for both channels. And the gain was still set for basically 0 dB gain. And the only thing really I did is increase the signal level. So with a large signal, a 2 volt RMS signal, this guy could have some problems as far as distortion. So definitely you wouldn't want to go that high for the right channel. Here's the MX110's frequency response using the auxiliary input with a 0 dBV or 1 volt RMS signal applied, and you're looking from 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz. The specification is that it should be plus or minus a half a dB over that range, and it's pretty darn close. We'll call it half a dB. The channel balance is maybe, at worst case, we'll say 0.6 of a dB or so, but they're pretty well matched throughout most of the band, except here in the mid-range. And that follows an adjustment of the bass and treble controls. Now the left and right are separate for each bass and treble controls. So if you tweak one, it affects the other just a little bit, although they're separate, but they're still real close to each other. And so I adjusted the bass and treble controls for each channel as best I could to get the flattest response, and this is what it looks like. Right now I've adjusted the main volume control as well as what I call the sub volume control for their maximum, just to see what kind of gain we can get out of this guy, and we're pretty close to 19 dB of gain. I've tweaked the balance control as best I could to get the two channels to match the gain levels. You can see we're putting out we'll call it 8.8 volts for the left channel and 9.2 volts for the right channel. Our THDs are better than the 0.3% THD that the spec was given. The SNRs aren't bad at, we'll call it 87, 88 dB. The THD plus noise minus 58 dB. The other thing to point out is that this is with a 0 dBV signal applied, or a 1 volt RMS input signal at 1 kilohertz. And here are what the harmonics look like with the MX110 operating at max gain with a 0 dBV signal applied to the input at 1 kilohertz. The second and third harmonics are pretty close to the same size for the most part. This plot shows the MX110's crosstalk, and this is for the auxiliary input with a 0 dBV signal applied to the active channel. And there is no specification for crosstalk. It's kind of here for reference. The worst case is for the right to left crosstalk, which would be about, we'll call it 36 dB here at the high end of the band. It's usually worse at the high end of the band. The channels seem to be showing about the same amount of crosstalk. And I should point out that this is with the gain control set for 0 dB gain. Here is the system noise level of the MX110, and this is using the auxiliary inputs, which have been terminated into shorts. The volume control has been set for 0 dB of gain, and we're kind of just looking at the noise from 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz, and there's no surprise the 60 Hertz hum right here, and then you have another one at 120. These two predominate the noise hum. And we have something here at 19 kilohertz. My guess is it's from the tuner section. The specification is that it should be 80 dB down from the maximum rated output, which I believe is 3 volts, which would be somewhere up here. So we are meeting that requirement. This plot shows the MX110's THD versus frequency for several different input signal levels. The frequency range is 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz. I'm using the auxiliary input, and the volume control is set for 0 dB gain. The 6 here indicates a 6 dBV input, and the minus 14 would be minus 14 dBV, or about 200 millivolts. The higher input signal levels give you the highest distortion for this preamp. If you keep in mind that the specification was better than 0.3%, which would basically be anything below this minus 50 dB line, it looks fairly good and would be meeting the spec all across the frequency band. The higher signal input levels, probably the 4s and the 6 dBVs, show distortion that is over a percent depending on the frequency. However, once you get down to the 2 dBV, it's not so bad, and 0 dBV works pretty good. So this is one case where you'd probably want to be careful that you weren't overdriving the preamp. Even though there is no specification for multitone response for the MX110, with the volume control set for 0 dB of gain and using the auxiliary input, we are getting a multitone response of between about 12 to 13 bits of distortion-free range. These plots show the effect of the MX110 high, low, and loudness filters, and the blue line down the center here, that's with everything set flat. This top trace right here, that is the loudness trace, kind of the smiley face sort of effect, more bass boost and a little less treble boost. Then we have our low filter, this guy right here, and we've got a 30 dB cut at 20 hertz. We are going from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, of course. And the high filter in green, it shows a cutoff beginning at about 3 kilohertz. It starts coming into play. So that's kind of what the different filters do on the MX110. Right now we're looking at the THD SNR plot with a 5 millivolt 1 kilohertz signal applied to the Phono 1 input. Our scale is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz for the frequency range. There really was no specification I could find on the Phono stage. This is the Phono 1 stage, which says magnetic for, I guess, a magnetic cartridge. The Phono 2 stage says crystal, so I guess that would be for a crystal kind of a cartridge. And I am measuring at the tape monitor output. I've also adjusted the Phono 1 gain control so that it is at its maximum, which has given us about 40 dB of gain. Right now our SNRs are 27, 28 dB. Not very good, and that's predominantly because we got this 60 hertz hum here. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the RIAA weighting, and when I do that, we get an improvement in the SNRs. The THD still look pretty good overall. So when we apply the RIAA weighting, it does improve the overall response of the unit, which is kind of what you would expect. And here is the frequency response of the Phono 1 stage with its gain control set for a maximum gain, which is about 40 dB. The frequency span is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and we do have a 5 millivolt signal applied across the band. I couldn't really find a specific specification for the Phono stage. We're within maybe 1.5 dB at the high end of the band, but at the low end of the band, probably below 100 hertz, we're already down a dB, and then it gets really bad at 20 hertz depending on which channel you're at, as much as 6.5 dB for the left channel and 3.5 dB for the right channel at 20 hertz. So overall, that is what our frequency response is looking like. Right now, we're looking at the difference between a 1 kilohertz signal going to the auxiliary left channel input and then coming out of the main left channel output, and they look pretty much to be in phase. And this is what happens if we switch that 180 degree phase shift button on the front. It will switch the phase of the left channel compared to the right channel by 180 degrees, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. And the reason for that would be if you weren't sure if you had your speakers wired in phase with each other, this would be an easy way to solve that problem rather than move the wires around. And this is actually what the phase difference is between the input and output. And basically, there is very little difference in phase at 1 kilohertz. If we shift down to 100 hertz, we do see a little bit of phase shift between the input and the output. And at 10 kilohertz, that phase shift is more. I'm not very good with Lissajous figures. That could be 10, 15 degrees, something like that. And if you look at the difference in phase between the left and right channels, this is what we're seeing. So there's very little difference in phase between the left and right channel. And this is at the main output, of course. And this shows the rise time between a signal going into the left channel auxiliary input and coming out of the main output. And there is no specifications for this, and it's showing a rise time of about 8 microseconds. I forgot to mention that the MX110 weighs in at about 28 pounds. As you saw from the test data, this particular MX110 did a fairly good job of meeting its specifications, at least using the auxiliary input. The Phono 1 input lacked a bit on the frequency response. Now, I have to admit that it wasn't until I was done measuring the data that I found out that there is another set of controls on the other side, I guess for the right channel, to adjust the gain, to fine-tune the gain for the two phono inputs as well as the auxiliary input. So I probably could have got that channel balance just a little bit better had I known that, but I wasn't going to go back and remeasure. So I thought it did okay, but the main thing with the Phono 1 was it had that low frequency roll-off. Other things that I learned is that the muting switch over here doesn't mute the volume in normal use. It only is for FM muting. And the FM radio, when I tested it, it worked okay, but the multiplex stereo light wouldn't always come on at the exact point that it should. Now the tuning eye did seem to work pretty well, but it probably needs a alignment for the FM tuner. I have no doubt that it could stand in alignment, but you could tune in a station, although it wouldn't have been in stereo, or at least the multiplex stereo light wasn't coming on then, or it seemed to be off a little frequency when the light did come on. So not a big deal for probably anyone that's going to use this, but if you wanted everything perfect, you would probably do an alignment on it. For my listening test, it was connected to my Carver M400A Cube power amplifier, which was then connected to the Wilson Watt 3 Puppy 2s. That little cube has 29 dB of gain or so, and it was amplifying the noise out of this guy. So at real low volume levels, or when the volume was at minimum, you could still hear a hum and hiss. But once the music started playing, it went away. And overall, listening to it, it sounded just fine. I didn't ever run out of volume gain coming out of it to drive the little cube. And so overall, I thought the sound was pretty nice. The loudness control had a little bit too much bass for what I would normally like out of a loudness control, but it definitely boosts the bass a lot, and not so much the highs, but it wasn't something that I used a lot for the listening test. And for the most part, it sounded really nice. It has a nice sound to it, I guess you would call it. I could have A-B'd it against my Carver C1, but I didn't really see a need to. It just is a nice sounding preamplifier, and it would be cool to have in your collection. Of course, it's a little in rough condition as far as the lettering and some of the stuff in back, but this particular MX110, as you saw from the tour when we looked at the bottom, most of the circuitry is original, as best I can tell. There are maybe one or two small capacitors that were replaced, and maybe one of the can filter caps, possibly, and a few resistors. But other than that, it looks pretty much original. I'm sure the tubes aren't the original tubes, but for something that is 62 years old that performs this well and sounds this nice, I can see why people like them. If you go on eBay, they seem to run anywhere from maybe $1,700 for one that's real rough to almost $4,000 for one that's in really nice shape that's been gone through. So it's a neat preamplifier, and I'm glad that I had a chance to use it. And it just goes to show, once again, how well McIntosh gear seems to hold up over the years. So that's kind of my take on this particular MX110. If you liked the video, of course, thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please do so to help the channel grow. And if you have any comments, obviously you can leave them in the comment area there, and I will respond back to you. And as always, until next time, have a great day, or night.